Welcome back to Bridging the Gap, a commentary on discrimination, marginalization, race, and identity at Duke. I'm your host, Cameron Oglesby, and this is part 2 in our Eco Experiences episode. Duke University is one of the leading institutions for environmental education in the country, but last time we dove headfirst into the problems around diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in environmental spaces at Duke, and in general. Today, we'll focus in on potential solutions to these systemic problems, discussing how Duke, on the whole, can center equity and justice as it looks to become the climate change university. As always, let's start the conversation off with our land acknowledgement. We here at Bridging the Gap want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that the greater university occupies as the ancestral lands of the Shakori, Ino, and Catawba Indian peoples. We hope that you will take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land you stand on as well. So, let's begin our solutions episode with a return to Danielle Purifoy, former Duke Nicholas School PhD student and current assistant professor in UNC's geography department.
The Nicholas School needs a dedicated program to environmental justice. North Carolina is technically the birthplace of environmental justice and as a social movement. There's a ton of work being done here that is a model for lots of other states, and I think that should be really well reflected in our academic institutions.
When asked what Duke could do better, sophomore Maya Ghanem highlighted the need for more robust international environmental justice perspectives, such as in the Global South or in the Middle East, in addition to racially and socioeconomically diverse perspectives.
I think that, one, having classes where different regions are represented in reference to environmental issues, I think just having that would be amazing. For example, in spring 2020, I took a class called Global Engineering in the Middle East. It basically focused on energy in the Middle East. And we learned a lot about environmental issues and energy infrastructure in the region. And I think through that, I was definitely able to learn a lot about, the environmental issues going on in the region and link it to imperialism and colonialism, two huge social issues, honestly, that are not discussed in reference to environmentalism enough. And but that class was offered in the history department. I think that class should be offered also in the environmental science department. And I think that more classes like that should be offered. I know that they have environmentalism in Latin America, but I think having, other regions represented, different identity groups represented. So environmentalism in Africa, environmentalism for the LGBTQ plus community, environmentalism for, Asia, things like that. Secondly, I think having a more diverse faculty would definitely, be amazing. Different races, but also individuals from different countries and different nationalities would be awesome to see, for sure. Even just within a class, having literature that is, representative of more perspectives, more regions. Because, I definitely think that literature in general and our education in general, a lot of the books and the founding pieces that we read are white perspectives, when I know that there's a lot of rich literature in all over the world, really. I wish there was more of a reckoning of how, racism, imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, all of these concepts and phenomenons and systems of oppression really have contributed and caused climate change and air pollution. That's just something that I wish was discussed more. And by discussing these oppressive systems, I hope then different identities and different regions and different groups are finally represented within environmental spaces. So just having a dialogue about that I think would be such a huge step. More people knowing about these things is a big deal. It's important. Like, there's so much to talk about, and there's so much intersectionality that needs to be covered. And it can be there's so many groups and so many identities that have different experiences. And by bringing those to the surface, we address the intersectionality, and in turn that benefits the environmental movement as a whole, because it includes more people. It's no longer just a, white liberal American elitist movement. It's something that everyone can get behind, and everyone can realize that they have a stake to play in this.
We've highlighted here that part of the work is in the curriculum. Duke Jr. Lizette Araya spotlighted one class this year, Planetary Health, which discussed the environment in the context of people and communities in a way that other courses did not. It was one of the driving forces in her decision to pick up an environmental science minor, a course that made her realize focusing on the environment was what she wanted to do all along.
What really speaks to me about planetary health in particular is, I think, that it has such an emphasis on intersectionality, and just this idea that, like, in order to really get to where we need to be, because right now we're in basically you either act now or it's going to get much worse. That's kind of where we are in the world, whether we like it or not. And so, it's this idea of in order to get to where we need to be, we need input from not just environmental scientists and not just environmental activists, but almost literally everyone. And so I think this idea is so important to me. And obviously it wasn't the first time I've heard about intersectionality. As a person of color, I think you just kind of grow up knowing kind of that concept. But it was the first time that I had seen it really emphasized in a course about environmental science, and just in a general environmental science space. And I guess kind of making that broader into what the Nicholas School can maybe do to try to get more people of color in their major and minor, I think is just really, really focus on that. And I think until the Nicholas School and other just environmental spaces in general, kind of understand that and understand the need for, widespread intersectionality, I don't think that they're really going to make much of a dent, I guess, with, engaging people of color. I think it's kind of a little bit sad for me to be a junior and realize that, what I actually wanted to study was something that I actually came to Duke with the intention of studying. And for, reasons that I talked about previously, I just didn't feel that was a space that I could necessarily inhabit, I guess. And then for me now to have taken a class and realized that okay, wait, maybe the environmental movement is starting to, make strides towards making space for people like me. I just wish that I would have been able, I guess that the support system within the Nicholas School was there.
In line with curricular shifts, let's hear from the Nicholas School's Director of Undergraduate Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Nicolette Kegel, for a moment. She shared with us her journey toward incorporating culturally inclusive pedagogy into her work, which is a student and experience-centered approach to teaching that incorporates diverse perspectives and dialogue around justice in a way that better supports students from diverse backgrounds in the classroom.
My interest in this came from a few different directions. When I had graduated from college, it was very clear to me that something was wrong with the environmental field as I saw it in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I had only one female professor in my environmental studies major when I went to college. I had no people of color as professors, nor did I do any research with people of color throughout undergrad. When I looked at the other majors and minors that I was, my cohort, there were very few people of color. And I knew something was wrong, like at a deep level, but I didn't have any language around that. And I was not in circles where people use language around diversity, equity, inclusion, or where it was even okay to explicitly talk about race. I grew up in the Midwest. There's a type of Midwestern politeness that means that we don't bring up people's identities readily and easily, or at least we didn't. I think things have changed a lot. And in Chicagoland, where I grew up, people tend to be a little bit more direct about those things. So after I graduated college, I became an AmeriCorps volunteer, and I was doing environmental science teaching in high schools in Knoxville, Tennessee. Knoxville was a big change for me in a lot of ways. And I taught at two schools. One was a rural high school and one was a high school in the middle of the city of Knoxville. They had very different demographics. And the way that I taught evolved because I was learning how to teach people that came from backgrounds different from myself in both instances, right? I had no experience with folks from rural Southern backgrounds. I had no real experience working with people of color or people from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And those were the two populations that I was working with. And so I realized I had to learn. And so I started learning. When I finally got into the Nicholas School, I wanted to continue that work. So there was a lot of time went by though. I got a PhD, I got a certificate in environmental education, I learned about teaching. And so my route into diversity, equity, and inclusion came through what I would say pedagogy, through learning best practices for really teaching people effectively. And it was later that I got the training in and learned about how this could be done, how this maybe should be done, the places people have gone wrong in developing what we first called pipelines, which we now call pathways into environmental fields. And that interest evolved into me doing strategic planning, me doing outreach programs, me doing actual research into environmental identity development. At some point around 2017, when I was being named, as someone that had experience, and I realized I don't have this experience and I need to gain it. I don't have the language and I need to gain it. I'm an ecologist trying to talk the language of society and social systems and trying to talk about oppression and injustice. And it took a lot of effort and reflection for me to be comfortable in those spaces and using that language. And it also helps me realize how much work my colleagues might need to go through to get to the same place. So when I think about curriculum, I want to first go to theory. And when you look at the theory of culturally inclusive pedagogy, a lot of things need to happen. People need to feel that their voices are heard. People need to be invited to collaborate, students in the classroom. We need to support difference We need to center what is often termed in the literature as marginalized voices, those folks with identities pushed off to the sides by kind of white supremacist culture in our case and context. We need to acknowledge colonialization and also embrace active learning. And so when we think about those as the tenets of culturally inclusive pedagogy, and we try to apply them to a curriculum, it does indicate that some changes should be made. Again, this is all me just talking from my experience, and this is my opinion. I'm not officially saying what the opinion of the Nicholas School is. But from my perspective, if we need to make content relevant, if that is a key tenet of culturally inclusive pedagogy, then that means bringing in stories, context, and folks from backgrounds that are different than we've historically seen in the Nicholas School. What this means in a big way to me is environmental justice. It means because environmental justice does exactly that. That's like how environmental justice got started, is basically centering marginalized voices, centering folks that have been pushed off to the side, whose voices weren't being heard, and then injustice continued to happen. We also need to center people of color, people of lower socioeconomic backgrounds, people of non-conforming identities, gender identities in our classroom. And so environmental justice provides a lot of good ways to do that, because environmental justice centers those stories. Environmental justice does a few other things too. We can learn about these communities. We can actually hear directly from folks representing these communities. And we can involve students so they can tell their own stories. And from a pedagogical standpoint, that's the best of all worlds, because when you start having people of color come in and tell their stories, that means mentors. That means that there are role models coming into the classroom to support students, right? That's fantastic. And then when you let students tell their own stories, well, then they're actually actively engaged. They're actively learning. They're co-constructing knowledge. And that's how learning works at its best.
Senior lecturer and Nicholas School professor Rebecca Vidra provided some additional context on who we tend to celebrate within the environmental literature and curricula.
I think that we need to think about our environmental curriculum really broadly and think about who's represented in that curriculum. Who are we reading? Who are we celebrating? There are a lot of heroes in the environmental movement, in environmental research, and we read their work and we, read the work that came after them that cited that work, the whole academic lineage. And I think it's time for us to look at that. And I'm happy to say that many faculty are, to say whose voice is not here and why are they not here? Frankly, many of us were not taught these perspectives, and we were not brought up in this rich, diverse literature. We were brought up in a very white, male-dominated literature research enterprise. And so it's taking some expansion to think about that. So I think for many of us, this is something we need to think about, kind of what does our curriculum include and who does it include? I do think environmental justice is important and can be woven into many of our classes, but I also want to caution people not to think of, we need to talk about all the bad things that happen to people of color and other marginalized communities. That's important. We need to understand environmental injustice, but we also have to be thinking about solutions. We have to be celebrating the heroes, the people who are making these changes at the community level. It's just as much about doing that work than, pointing out all the problems. I'm not sure if we all just started talking about, I think we should all talk about environmental injustice. I think it's really important. But if we don't have that other part, that sort of lifting up, then I think we're going to become even more gloomy than we already are as a curriculum. I don't necessarily think that's going to attract people unless we're really working in the solution space.
I'll add that incorporating environmental justice and intersectionality into the curriculum alone will not fix the problem. Second year Master of Environmental Management student Rani Kumar highlights that environmental justice is not the same as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that the work needs to be separate and deliberate.
There are a lot of reasons outside of the Nicholas School not offering environmental justice that you do not see people of color at the Nicholas School. Some of that does have to do with the environmental field as a whole, just not being diverse and having this, white conservation background that was explicitly not open or available to people of color. And so I think the importance of having environmental justice curriculum can't be about DEI, because environmental justice is not just about Black and brown people or people of color. It is integral to the future of the environmental justice movement. It has to be. So it can't just be and I don't think, I'm not trying to imply that this is what people are saying, but it can't just be the work of brown and Black people or, people of color. It has to be the work of everyone. And until everyone sort of focuses and shifts that center of what is actual equity and justice, then you're always going to have sort of like a subpar program. You're always going to have sort of like subpar results because you're missing half the story. Environmental justice has to be looked at as and considered an important academic focus on its own without it relating to necessarily having to be brown or Black people who are involved specifically. And I think the other danger of that, of just saying if we have EJ, then we fix the DEI issues at the Nicholas School, is imagine the work, and this is the invisible work of all, it happens to female faculty, but it happens especially to faculty of color, that you'll have this EJ professor who most likely, because that's a lot of the people in the field, when they do the search for the EJ professor, will most likely be a person of color. And so their job is to teach environmental justice. Their job is not to fix DEI issues at the Nicholas School or be the representation of entire race and entire segment of the environmental field. So it just sets them up to fail, right? It sets them up to have to take on the kind of sins of the Nicholas School when they really should be teaching and educating students about this field of environmental justice, which again is completely separate from not completely separate, but should be separate from the DEI issues at the Nicholas School. If the Nicholas School wants to have environmental justice in its curriculum, they need to do that, but that won't address its DEI issues. The fact that I am a representative of diversity at the Nicholas School is always laughable to me because yes, I am brown. And yes, I have Indian heritage, but I come from a super privileged community in Colorado. I grew up in a white community. That's really laughable to me that I am the pinnacle of someone who in reality, yes, all these things matter so much to me and I am impacted by these things, but I just feel, and again, it shouldn't be that you have to come from a super underprivileged place to speak on these issues. But I do think there is something to be said of there aren't even those voices at the Nicholas School, and to have them filtered through most of the people leading this work with me at the Nicholas School, are either biracial or white, and we just don't have those voices, and we don't want to put that burden on students of color at the Nicholas School. But there's just something to be said already that it is so insulated. We just don't have that culture to engage with already. Yeah, so I feel I agree. The administration is in a tough spot because I don't think there is a simple solution. I think it's going to take continuing to have actual tough conversations. I was in a book group yesterday with this author who wrote a really interesting called a biography of the Great Smoky Mountains, and she's pretty critical of the National Park Service and the history of the National Park Service in the Smokies. And she said one thing that she was really trying to do with her book was, it's called The Wild East, was get to the story of what was going on while also supporting, while also acknowledging the beauty of what the Park Service had done in a lot of ways. And so I think that's kind of her main point was remember but rejoice. And I think the Nicholas School and Duke in general, a lot of academia in the environmental field, so I'm not trying to just pick on the Nicholas School, but we're trying to get to the rejoice part really fast without really remembering what isn't working and what hasn't worked and why it hasn't worked. And so I don't know if you can get to the rejoice part without being oh, what hasn't worked? And that's a question, right, that the whole country is going through.
The biggest and most consistent component mentioned in these conversations has been that Duke needs to invest money in this work, to put their money where their mouth is.
I'm a student who cares about these issues, but I am by no means an expert in these fields. I am trying to become an expert in areas related to the environment. I think all these are like related and interrelated, but if you're worried about having equitable racial justice in your college, go hire somebody who that's their field and that's what they work in, and have that be the person that does that. And so I think, just already looking to best practices that are established, because they're already out there. It's not like, I think the recreating the wheel of like, oh, we have to do a committee or we have to do all this. It's like, well, no, there are people who have like made their careers out of this. So like, let's listen to them, and actually follow their advice. And another thing, and it's just the truth of like any of these movements or anything that's going on, just put your money where your mouth is, right? Like, again, I know that's like more complicated than just how it's easier for me to simply say that. But when you look at the COVID response, they found the money to test all these people, bring all these people back. If you want to do it, you can do it. And that's just the reality of how the world works.
I would like to turn again to the example of Danielle Purifoy, a well-known environmental justice advocate in Durham, a board member for the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, a member of Durham Beyond Policing, a lawyer and a professor. She spends her free time writing for Southerly Magazine or Scalawag on injustices such as wood pellet plants and hog farm pollution in North Carolina. She spent years at Duke and found in the end that our rival, UNC, had a more robust program for her. It can't just be about the curriculum or the faculty hires. There is a cycle by which passionate, qualified, justice-oriented students of color circle through Duke and at times its environmental spaces, and then move elsewhere, whether for a lack of support or a lack of adequate environmental justice infrastructure. I asked Nicolette how we break this cycle and retain students and faculty in a space that is so slow to change.
So, in my opinion, we break the cycle in two ways. One is that we create a truly inclusive environment. We need to break down some of the norms of our culture in the Nicholas School and at Duke, to be more inclusive, to be less hierarchical, to be more supportive, to be broader. So that's one step. But the second step probably is to put money where our mouth is and to actually invest in a dean, assistant dean position for diversity, equity, inclusion, invest in environmental justice professorship. It's easier said than done. The money has to come from somewhere. Fundraising needs to happen. In my opinion, it would be fantastic if Big Duke, that is really thinking about race right now, would be willing to fund positions across campus that advance racial equity in a real way. For the Nicholas School, that would be two positions. There'd be a Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion position and an Environmental Justice position. For the School of Public Policy or for law school or for Trinity, those positions needs might be and should be different. But I think that every part of our university could benefit from having an infusion of resources and funding provided by Big Duke to really advance these efforts. And in the meantime, our Dean Toddy Steelman, she is working to fundraise for environmental justice positions. But it takes a while to do that work.
I think the reassuring part comes in the fact that Duke's environmental community is trying. The Nicholas School recently came out with its Career and Academic Innovation and Research Network of Scholars, or CAIRN's mentorship program, designed to support students of color who are interested in the environment as they attempt to navigate the Nicholas School. If you have the pleasure of interacting with faculty like Rebecca Vidra, Nicolette Kegel, or Dean Toddy, then you can see the work and the effort going in. It is slow, but it is happening. But we need to continue to examine these actions critically. Are we, as a community and as a university, moving past the lip service of 2020's charged moment to put in that same effort? Hopefully that leaves you all with something to think about. And perhaps you saw your own major or degree program reflected in the sentiments of our guests. Let's round out the episode with another poem. This time, a reading by Shay Von Gaber. This performance, titled If Only, is a spoken word about the ever-looming threat of climate change, a piece that should hopefully remind us of the commonality of planet Earth as something that connects us and something we all rely upon. Here's If Only.
Nostalgia is a bitch. That longing for something far from you, from truth. That painful pining for someone left behind in the backyard, basement, mattress fort that you built when you were 9. That yearning, that pang of conscience, of wanting one more slice, one more hot sip of summers at camp, late nights with Mario, Yoshi, Luigi, easy it all was. I remember being young and full of wonder, full of wishes of witchcraft, ghosts in the closet, and journeys on boats down the Atlantic, commander-in-chief of my own crew, sailing forth towards dirty pirates with lightsabers. I remember being young and full of wonder, of wishing for a grand and Hollywood romance when I grew up, burying my grown-up toes in grown-up sand on a grown-up beach, holding hands with a grown-up boy in a grown-up land. I remember wishing for the moon when told the sky was the limit. But that was then, and today is now, and tomorrow will be too late for wishing. In 200 years, when the Earth's crust is dried up and sawdust fills the lungs. In 200 years, when oceans burn and tuna become rare delicacies. When the acidification of our waters gets too high, too much, too late to turn back the clock on the dissolution of entire ecosystems. In 200 years, when a small child will ask, "Daddy, what was coral like? What is a polar bear? Did you wear a breathing mask when you were younger? Daddy, what do stars look like? I can't see through the smog. I can't see through the puff of poison, the harrowing cloud of pollution, of infection, of corruption, of old men's dreams of big money and big oil. I can't see through the greed, the complete and utter ignorance of greenhouse effects for houses full of green, of digits, numbers, plastered on plastic and drenched on paper. Daddy, tell me about trees. Did the Amazon really exist? Was Florida always underwater? Daddy, I wish I could walk on a beach. I wish bees were still around. Mommy always talks about those flowery things. Daddy, I wish you saved the earth. I remember being young and full of wonder. I remember wishing I was a vampire or Indiana Jones. I wished I could breathe underwater, but that was then, and today is now, and tomorrow is too late for the wishes of mermaids when the oceans are destroyed. When CO2 is number 1 on the watch list. When the king of Atlantis rules New Orleans. When UV exposure is at its highest and the sun is cancer. When nostalgic memories of riding my bike through the neighborhood park are magical tales told at night to get children in bed. Tomorrow is too late for the wishes of boys and superpowers and monsters and toys and sailing pirate ships, because tomorrow will be spent wishing we listened, wishing we acted sooner.
We hope you enjoyed this latest episode of Bridging the Gap. We hope in this series to keep the conversation going around what needs doing and what is happening around race, identity, and space at Duke. Here's to an Earth Month that is full of conversations, evaluations, and self-reflections. And relaxation, of course. Thanks for joining us.